So we're running a little bit short on time this morning, so I'm just going to go and try and get straight into it. The message that I'm bringing this morning, it comes from a passage of the Bible that has often been seen as just a story for kids in Sunday school. But I want to show you this morning that there is a lot in it here for adults as well. The title of my message this morning is going to be Slaying Giants. So no prize for guessing what this message is going to be all about or where it comes from. You know, the Bible constantly reminds us that at various times we will be confronted with giants in this life. You know, there will always be things that will come up against us, issues that seem larger than life, problems which will sometimes even seem unsurmountable, you know, just no way to deal with them. And we look at the trials and the temptations and everything that come our way, and we think, we can't deal with this. You know, we sometimes think that we can't get on top of things. But I believe that it is possible to have victory over the giants that pop up in our life. And I believe, as we go through the scripture reading, that you will see some of the principles that will help you in dealing with them. So if I can just have the guys put up 1 Samuel 17 on the screen. We don't have time to go through and read the whole 54 verses, and hopefully you have sufficient knowledge of this story that we don't have to keep going backwards and forwards to the verses. I'm just going to walk through this chapter in sections. It's the story, of course, of David and Goliath, and hopefully we'll see how we can deal with giants. So if we can start going through the first 11 verses, if you're familiar with them, maybe you want to take your Bibles and open them up to that as well. In the first 11 verses, we see three things. Three things I want you to observe. In this battle, look at who started the war. Who started the war, where the war was being fought, and on whose terms it was being fought. You know, verse 1 tells us that the Philistines had gathered their forces for war. So it was the Philistines, Israel's constant enemy, who started the war. Israel wasn't looking for a fight. The Philistines were. The Philistines had travelled east into Judah from their territory near the Mediterranean Sea to do battle with the Israelites. So the Philistines, the enemy, had chosen the time and the place for the battle. And in verses 4 to 11, we find that the Israelites gave passive consent to fighting the war on the enemy's terms. The Philistines had proposed that instead of the two armies doing the actual fighting, that the Israelites choose one man from their army to engage their champion Goliath in battle. And if the person Israel chose was able to slay Goliath, then the Philistines, allegedly, would lay down their arms and surrender to the Israelites. If, however, Goliath won, the Israelites had to surrender to the Philistines. Now, please note, the Israelites did not put forward a counter proposal. They didn't formulate a plan on their own. They let the enemy dictate the terms. And this was the big mistake. There's a couple of things I want us to see from this. First of all, not all the giants that we'll face in this life will be of our own making, nor will they arise at a time or a place of our choosing, or a time which is convenient. You know, you can be quietly going about your own business, troubling no one, and still end up having to face giants. All of us will have giants to deal with. And here's my second point. We don't always have to fight our giants. We don't always have to fight our enemies on their terms and in the same manner. You know, when confronted with a giant, don't immediately throw your hands up in the air. Don't be a pushover. Don't allow yourself to be railroaded. And try not to be forced into a situation where you have to fight on someone else's terms. Go away, develop your own plan and your own way of dealing with it. You know, there is more than one way to deal with giants. And we discover those ways when we seek God, when we've got faith, when we remain calm, just chill, take some time out and pray. And when we do these things, we find other ways and better ways of conquering giants. Look at verses 12 to 32. In verse 12, David appears on the scene, and in a moment we'll look at how he handles the situation. An important part of this message will come from observing the difference in the way that David deals with the giant from the way that Saul and his army were dealing with him. Verse 16 tells us that for 40 days, every morning and evening, Goliath had been coming out and taunting and challenging the Israelites. What does that show us? Well, it shows me that for 40 days the Israelites had done absolutely nothing about dealing with this giant. They hadn't prayed. They hadn't formulated a plan. Maybe they were just hoping that the problem would simply vanish, that one morning they'd wake up and it was just all a bad dream. Now, I want to compare Saul's actions and the Israelites' actions with two other kings we read about in the Old Testament. In 2 Chronicles 20, we find that when Israel's king, King Jehoshaphat, faced a similar situation, he acted immediately. He called upon all the people to pray and to fast, and they all came to Jerusalem seeking God and crying out for God to intervene. And I'm sure many of you know the rest of the story. God answered their prayers, and he told them what to do. And the people marched out against their armies carrying no weapons other than the praises they were singing to God. And God confused the armies, which ended up fighting against each other rather than Israel. Also compare Saul's action with that of King Hezekiah. In 2 Kings 19, we learn that when King Hezekiah and the people of Judah were threatened by the Assyrian army, Hezekiah took the letter that he had received from Sennacherib's messengers into the temple. He spread it out before the Lord and in faith said, God, you deal with it. Hezekiah had the faith to believe that God was well able to sort out this Assyrian army. And God did. Overnight he sent an angel, and the angel went out and put to death 185,000 men of the Assyrian army. Battle over. You know, Hezekiah prayed, God answered, problem solved. You see, unlike Saul, Hezekiah and Jehoshaphat did not accept their enemies' terms. In faith, they sought God for a way of dealing with them. And God dealt with their giants. And I believe he will deal with yours also if you too come to him in faith. Saul procrastinated. He did nothing. And what was the result? Well, I want you to see the downward spiral in this chapter. In verse 11, it tells us that when Israelites first saw Goliath, they were dismayed. By verse 24, it says they're full of fear. And after 40 days, it says they have lost heart. What does that mean, they've lost heart? It means that they're on the verge of surrendering. They're one step away from surrendering. And you know, this is what happens when we procrastinate, when we do nothing, when we hope that our problems will all in some way just vanish or disappear. They don't. Sorry, they don't. Instead, what happens is our giants just grow larger the longer we put off tackling them. You know, sometimes we even allow midgets to grow into giants. You know, we put off dealing with small things, things which could have been easily handled with very little effort. We put them off until one day we find that we're now dealing with something of gigantic proportions. You know, when problems arise, sitting back and doing nothing is not an option which will produce a positive result. It just allows the situation to develop to almost unmanageable proportions. You know, we go from being slightly concerned to dismayed to fearful and surrendering to the problem. Eventually we get to the place where we think there's just nothing we can do about this. You know, sadly, many people surrender to life's challenges. Their problems and fears dominate them. You know, I'm thinking of people I know that they've a problem and so forth that arose many years ago and it's still directing their life. It was never ever dealt with then. It's still with them, and it's still steering their life. You know, you've got to deal with things as they arise. Can I also say that while the men of Israel were sitting down on a hill doing nothing, what do you think the wives were doing back home? We're not told, but I can almost hear them saying, 40 days they've been gone. Why don't they make a decision and get on with it? And I'm sure there is many a wife today that has also looked from leadership from a husband, hoping that he would just make a decision and get on with it. Okay, so let's see how David dealt with Israel's giants. This is in verses 33 to 51. So we saw in verse 20 that David arrived at the scene of the battle with supplies for his brothers. Shortly after his arrival, Goliath stepped forwards and he puts on his usual morning performance. And David immediately notices the fear in his fellow countrymen and finds that they are on the verge of giving up. So David realizes that unless something is done and done quickly, his nation will be history. So he goes to Saul and he says, I'll deal with the giant. Since Saul has no other plan and is already looking for a white flag, I believe, he accepts David's offer. So now let us see how David deals with Goliath and see if there's something here that we can use to deal with our giants. The first step David took after he became fully aware of the problem was to consider the skills and the experience that he had to deal with it. In verse 34 and 37, you see that David recalls the times when he was shepherding a flock of sheep and he had to deal with bears and he had to deal with lions. And he realizes that Goliath is nothing more than another loud-mouthed animal. You know, David's past victories have given him confidence to believe that he can be victorious over Goliath as well. You see, folks, to be victorious over giants, you first have to conquer a few midgets. What am I saying? I'm saying that before you try to deal with major issues, you need some past experience in dealing with small matters. You know, begin with dealing with some of the smaller issues around you, then some medium-sized concerns before taking on a gigantic problem. The second thing we note here is that David dealt with the giant immediately. Notice that David didn't sit around on the hill with the other guys, all the other soldiers, for a couple of weeks, making up his mind whether or not I'd do something. Do you know why? Because the soldiers had already given up hope. They'd become a bunch of losers in their minds. And if David had continued to hang out with them, he would have ended up thinking like one of them. You know, one of the things that motivational speakers will often say is, it's hard to soar like an eagle when you're surrounded with a bunch of turkeys. You know, if you have a major problem to deal with, don't hang around with a bunch of losers. Negative people produce after their own kind. More negative people with negative advice and negative attitudes. In life, you'll achieve far more from being with positive people and people who have faith and hope and can-do attitudes. Scrap all those negative people that you've been dealing with. Get rid of them. Find a crowd that's going to sow something into your life. You know, steer clear of the people who are already defeated and just going through the motions. But you know, if all you've got is a bunch of losers around you sometimes, then you're just going to have to push them behind and act alone. Just, you know, and you're never alone, really, if you have faith in God, are you? You're not acting alone if you have faith in God. And David found, in this instant, he had to act alone. In verse 38, we find that Saul accepted David's offer, but he tried to kit him out with his own weapons. You know, Saul wanted to give him the weapons which he had already decided were insufficient for dealing with Goliath. Think about it. If the battle could be won by a person equipped with Saul's armour, helmet and sword, then why hadn't Saul used these weapons 40 days before when Goliath first issued the challenge? You know, David, in deference to his king, tried them on, but he quickly realised that they were going to be more of a hindrance than a help. When facing battles with giants, we have to make similar decisions. You know, some people will try to help us fight our battles. And sometimes their assistance and advice is just what we need. And we should welcome it. Never be too proud to accept help from others. Don't be so cocky as to think you can succeed without other people's help. Listen to their advice, but weigh it up. Is it something you can work with? Is it good advice? If not, discard it. In the end, you have to fight with what you know and what you can use. You know, David at this time, he didn't know how to wield a sword. But boy, was he deadly effective with a slingshot. And he knew also one important thing which Saul and his men seemed to have forgotten. David knew that in the end, it was not what he could do with a slingshot that counted, is what God could do and wanted to do in this situation, which was important. Look at verse 45, guys, if we can just flick verse 45 up. It says, David said to the Philistine, you come with me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. So we find that David, this kid, could see something his older brothers couldn't see, Israel couldn't see, and even his king couldn't see. And that was that the Philistines were not just Israel's enemies, they were also God's enemies. Let me remind you of something. Let me take you back a little. Goliath was what? A giant. What had prevented the original group of Jews who came out of Egypt from entering the Promised Land? Giants. The original group of Jews refused to take and enter the Promised Land because they did not believe that even with God's help, they were capable of dealing with a group of giants. Now, 400 years later, Saul and his men are about to surrender the land which God had given their ancestors because they didn't believe that God could deal with even one giant. The fact of the matter is that when Joshua and the Israelites entered the Promised Land, they never fully completed God's task of destroying all the giants in the land. And so 400 years later, the nation of Israel was still being threatened by giants. Now, I believe that this speaks loudly to us about the need to completely deal with the giants in our life. You know, if we don't deal with them once and for all, they will keep coming back and they'll keep coming back and they'll threaten not only us, but those that come after us as well. Some things just have to be stopped once and for all, dealt with. You know, for our own sakes and the sakes of those that come after us, we need to confront the giants which threaten to crush us today. We need to learn from David here. You know, David has a God-saturated mind. When he speaks of this battle with Goliath, he refers to God 9 times and Goliath only twice. And I believe that if we stay as focused on God as David was, and truly believe that we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us, then there is no giant today which is too big for us to deal with. So David prepares to deal with the giant. He rejected the armour. He knew that God and a slingshot was all he needed. Having decided how he was going to deal with the giant, what did he do next? Well, verse 48 tells us that he ran quickly to engage him. Notice that once David had formulated his plan and selected his weapon, he went into action. You know, David wasn't approaching this battle timidly. He wasn't taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. He wasn't having second thoughts. And really, you can't deal with issues any other way. you resolve to deal with it, you formulate your plan, you equip yourself for the task, and in faith you go out and do it. That's it. Now, two last things. One, make sure that your giant is definitely, positively dealt with. In verse 50, we find that one stone from David's slingshot took care of Goliath. But David took no chances. To make sure his giant was not getting up again, he used Goliath's own sword to remove his head. The message here is, don't assume you've dealt with a giant just because you've put a good dent in it. Okay? Make sure. Don't allow it to raise its ugly head again. Deal with it once and for all. And the last thing I want you to note about David's battle with Goliath is that he took 5 stones from his slingshot. 5 stones he took with him, not just one. Why? In case he missed? No. David was an expert with that slingshot, man. I tell you, he was never, ever going to miss. So why 5 stones? Well, I'm going to give you something here. It's in 2 Samuel 21, and it's in verses 15 to 22. And in verse 22, it speaks about 4 other giants. Now, Bible scholars are a little bit divided on this, but many believe that the 4 giants mentioned in these verses were either Goliath's brothers or sons. There's 4 of them. If that would correct, that would explain the 5 stones. 1 for Goliath and 1 for each of the 4 descendants. You see, sometimes when we're dealing with problems and we try to sort out something, we upset a few other things around the way. And one could well imagine that in David slaying Goliath, if those other brothers that had been around the place, guess what they were going to do? So, the thing is here, plan for eventualities. You know, you think you've got the solution solved, but just think, if I deal with this, what's the likely outcome? What could eventuate from me dealing with this? So you don't need to just formulate a plan to deal with the giant. You need to look at the other eventualities and so forth as well. And so we can see that David was prepared. He was prepared for whatever else might come from him defeating Goliath. The final thing I want you to see from David's victory over Goliath is that David's victory inspired the confidence of others. At the end of verse 51, we see that once David lifted up the head of Goliath and the Israelites could plainly see that the giant was dead, they took off after the Philistines. The Israelites, who for 40 days had been sitting around afraid to act, suddenly found the courage to confront the enemy and go out there and fight. You know, in a church, in a family, in a community, sometimes all that is needed to get people motivated and moving forward is for one person to take a stand. One person with the faith to believe that with God's help it is possible to slay the giants that the enemy wants us to cower to. You know, our enemy wants to keep us fearful. He wants to keep us inactive. He wants us to keep getting scareder and scareder and scareder. Too scared to do anything, too scared to go forth, too scared to speak up and say anything. He doesn't want the people of the church to be victorious, growing in faith and confidence. So he regularly sends forth his giants to keep us in check. For he knows that if we get a taste of victory, his power over us will be broken. But God wants us to be giant slayers. And often all it takes for a church to have the faith to engage the enemy is for one person who truly believes that with God all things are possible. One giant dealt with, and a lot of people move forward. Not just you, you can take a lot of people with you into victory just by you taking a stand. And that's also what it takes in our personal life. Every day we are presented with challenges, small, large, and we can be like David, deal with the giant and move forward. Or we can be like Saul and his men, living in an atmosphere of fear and gloom, waiting for the inevitable, the day when the giant will wipe us out completely. So this morning I just want to say to you, which will you choose? You're going to be like one of those people sitting on the hill waiting for the whole thing to swamp you, to conquer you, to override you, to take you out? Or are you going to be like David? Are you going to grow close to God? I'll just say this on Father's Day. I know a lot of ladies, you know, your men have different activities and they get their thrills and everything in different ways. You know, got some motorbikes here. Some guys like to get on a motorbike. Some like to go and fly planes, and some even like to get out and do a bit of gardening and play music and all of that sort of thing. But ladies, the best husband that you can ever have, I think, is one that draws close to God. When the chips are down, he's on his knees. He's not out on a motorbike, no problems with motorbikes and everything, but he's not out on a motorbike, he's not out fishing, or he's not down the pub with the guys. He's on his knees and he's prayer. He's seeking God. Amen? Amen.